welcome to the shed. Today's video I'm going to show you how to check your squares for square and also correct out of square squares. Hope you enjoy. So when it comes to hand tool woodworking, you want to make sure that the squares you're using are square. Whether that's a combination square, now some of these cheaper ones can be out of square, and especially these vintage styles tend to go out of square quite easily because they're only held by a few pins. So you want to make sure that your square is square and that it stays square. So let me bring you in here and I'll show you how we check whether our squares are square to start with. Okay, so what I'm going to do here to show you so you can see this easily against this, I'm going to use a pencil to do this. But just know you should be using a marking knife to do this because it's going to be more accurate. But just for ease of you seeing it on the camera, I'm going to use the pencil for doing this. And it's just going to make it that little bit easier for you. And then later on, after that's complete, I'm going to go ahead and I'll show you it with the knife just to do the final confirmation. So I still want to show you so you can see it with the pencil, but we do want to make sure that it's accurate. So I'm going to use the knife right at the end just to ensure that the square is actually square. So we're going to sit it here like this. And we're going to strike a line down. Now I'm going to use a mechanical pencil because it's going to get us a nice fine pencil line, as you can see just here. It's a very thin pencil line. These are quite thin leads. And then you want to come back up right onto that line at this end nearest to your fence. You want to make sure your lead sits on top of your previous line and then run it again. So just here you can see where we've done these lines, or I hope you can see, that up to here it's one solid line to about there, and then we deviate and get slightly larger. It's about a millimeter gap here, and at this end about 1.5 millimeters. So I now know that the square is out of square through this section here. So we're going to move on and look at the combination square next, and then we'll come back and revisit and re-square up the square so you can see how to do it for yourself. So let's get going. I just wanted to bring in my combination square as well and do the same thing. Run a line down, bring this in the other way like before. Right on top, and this line just here, and we've come back in dead on top of it, which tells me that my combination square is square. So now we're going to move back to this vintage style, which are the most common ones to be out of square, and I'm going to show you how we correct this to bring it back into square. So we want to bring our square across and we want to mark onto here, onto the blade, roughly where it is, so we know where we're working from. Now, because we've got a gap here, we know when we've gone this way and that way, we've ended up with that gap. Which means that to get that gap from here, this blade is slightly narrower just here, just from being used. That little bit amount of discrepancy when doing hand tool work and sawing on lines and stuff is probably not going to make a big difference, but we do want this to be square. So now we're going to move into a file to try and correct this. Now we don't need to remove much. This is just a single cut fine file. So there's no double cut, only ridges going in one direction. So we're going to use the single cut fine file. So we're going to come and bring it over into the vise now. We can use our saw plate holder for this because we need to clamp it in and get a little bit of space and gap on the fence here. Line it up, get it partially clamped to start with. So you can sometimes just partially clamp them and then release it and put the blade back in. Like this. And then we're going to clamp that down and hold it. So we know that we put our marking here, and this was where it was out of square with the rest of it. So what we need to do is bring this part of the blade of the square back into the same alignment as this top end, since this is worn and this spot's not worn as much. So in this case we're going to be filing from our line, which is just here, so I'm going to mark that onto the piece of wood. It's another advantage of putting it in the piece of wood. You can mark your piece of wood where you know you need to work from. And now, we don't want to do too much on this, and we don't want to just file straight into it and damage this at all. We want to take off a little bit, check it, take off a little bit, check it. So to do this, we're going to come in and we're going to do what's called draw filing. So you're going to try and keep your file square and just push it like that. Now, we went out by much, so I'm going to do maybe 5 or 6 passes like this. And now we're going to go back to the piece of wood and check it again. Now, you will form a little burr here, but we're going to check to make sure this is square first, and then we can actually run the entire thing on a diamond plate to make sure it's flat as well. That is another way of doing it. But you want to remove this little bit of material first. We've got our square back out, and our pencil. Whoop. Make sure your pencil doesn't snap. We've got a single line there. Now, to check this, sometimes it's easier to put 2 lines side by side if you're not using the knife. That's the other way of doing it. When we come in here, we want to check that the gap looks equal all the way through between these 2 lines. Now, it's hard to check these with a ruler, but you can try and check it with a ruler to see the gap. So right here, you might want to go with the side where you've got the smaller increments. So if we look here, that's about 2.5 millimeters down this end of the line, and up the top end of the line here, we're a little bit under 2.5 mil here. So instead of taking the file back to this, because that's going to remove too much, since I have a 1200 grit diamond stone, I'm going to move to that, and we're just going to try and keep that square and just run this back and forward on here a little bit in its entirety. So we should keep the whole thing square, but we're going to still concentrate down this bottom end because that's where we know we need to take the material off. But by keeping positive pressure down on this bottom end, we shouldn't remove material here and only remove it where it needs to be removed. Now, we're also looking for a nice clear metal line all the way along here, nice and shiny, because it had lost a little bit of its metal before. So we've made contact all the way along, and hopefully we're now square. So we're going to come back and do this test again. So I'm going to move over here, and we're going to try and make a nice dark line here for you so you can see it. Now we're going to come in this side, going to leave a little gap and do the same. If we look here, the gap between this line's about 2 mil there. And almost the same at that end now. So the final test is obviously to use your knife, and let's just go ahead and do that now so we can tell entirely whether we've got this correct or not. Bring it up against the knife. Make sure your knife stays on the surface. Now, if I look here, there is an ever so slight line there, and we can see that this little thin slither, which is a fraction of a millimeter, just came off. Now, that means that we are still out an itty bitty bit. Now, that's probably not enough to worry about. That's never really going to affect anything, but if you're a stickler, you can try and correct that some more, and we can work it like this. This is another way. We're going to work just that bottom end, keeping this right on it. So, or like this. We know we need to take a little bit more off this end here. And then we can check it once more with the knife. Always best to use the knife. It's going to be the most accurate way for you to do this test. Now you can probably see this line here, just here. We're going to come back up into it again. Flat up against your knife. And if we look back here, this is only one solid line now. So now this outside edge of our square is nice and flat, and we have already smoothed it with the diamond plate. Now what I want to do is just make sure there's no burrs on these edges. So on the diamond plate, we're just going to sit it flat and just give it a quick run back and forwards like this. Make sure there's no burr anywhere along that. And now I've brought this one back into square. Now you can likewise do the same on the inside here. So let's go ahead and just, out of point of interest, let's have a quick look and see how square the inside of this blade is. But I don't often use the inside of a square for doing any square measurements. So usually I'm not too worried about this internal one just here. But this is important if you're using your square to see if something's square around the outside. So that's where this comes in. So I'm going to once again try to do this with the knife for you. You want to make sure you're referencing your knife properly when you're doing these sort of things. Make sure you're using it correctly. Now I'm going to do a video coming up where I show you how to actually use the knives properly, whether it's this style or the double beveled style. And this one here, and we've had one straight line, so internals of this one are square and the externals are square. So there you go, folks. This is really the foolproof way of testing to see if your square is square. You can use it on the inside, you can use it on the outside, you can use it on vintage squares that have obviously wooden fences on the outside. And if you have some of these type that don't have the brass, which is best if you're looking for a vintage one, get one that's got the brass, because that's going to give you the most accurate reading. Some of them do, however, that are cheaper, and you do find them out there. They've only got the wooden fence, and in some cases it might be easier for you to true up the wooden fence to make it square, but it's going to be difficult to try and do that because you don't know exactly where that is going to be out of square, and that's why blade adjustment's easiest, especially with the test I showed you here. Now, some people say that you can use a square to test squares, and you can if you've got an accurate, maybe engineering square that you can use. But on these style that have got the wood on the outside, because they're not machined dead 90 degrees, you can't test this outside part of the blade to see if it's square. So that's why I don't like that test being used, because it's only accurate on squares that are meant to be machined square on the outside of the fences, and that's never how you use a square to actually do joinery when it comes to woodworking. You might use them for checking for square and things on, table saw blades and other mechanical items, but for woodworking we don't use squares like that, so we don't need engineering squares to perform that function. But if you have a combination square, you can probably do that function with your combination square as well. So if you like this video and you'd like to see some more tips and tricks on how to square up vintage tools and make sure your vintage tools are working and all restored and operating correctly, please like and subscribe to get this video out to others like you, so I can help more people like yourself. And If you'd like to support me a little bit further, please consider checking me out on Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/aussiewoodshed. And if you like this video and you'd like to see some more videos like this, please check out the videos on the screen here right now. Bye for now.